pounds on me, so I got that fire on me. In the desert heat, I'm burning marijuana, trying to fill bags with green and blue cheese. In the city, the only thing that matters is the money, and that's the only thing I want, honey. I live the life that's crummy, so I want my gold like a day sunny. Once upon a time.
Hey, this is Bear Rabbit, and this is the Mitra Blue episode series. For today, I guess we're going to be continuing the book read. So, we're going to be continuing the second chapter of the narrative of Mr. Frederick Douglass. So, let's do that. And this is going to be the second chapter. Alright. Chapter 2. My master's family consisted of 2 sons, Andrew and Richard, 1 daughter, Lucretia, and her husband, Captain Thomas Old. They lived in one house upon the home plantation of Colonel Edward Lloyd. My master was Colonel Lloyd clerk and superintendent. He was what might be called the overseer of the overseers. I spent 2 years of the childhood on this plantation in my old master's family. It was here that I witnessed a bloody transaction recorded in the first chapter, and I received my first impression of slavery on the plantation. I will give some descriptions of it, and of slavery as it there existed. The plantation is about 12 miles north of Eston in Talbot County and is situated on the border of Miles River. The principal products raised upon were tobacco, corn, and wheat. These were raised in great abundance, so that with the products of this and other farms belonging to him, he was able to keep in almost consistent employment a large sloop in carrying them to the market at Baltimore. This sloop was named Sally Lloyd in honor of one of the colonel's daughter. My master's son-in-law, Captain Old, was master of the vessel. She was otherwise manned by the colonel-owned slaves. Their names were Peter, Isaac, Rich, and Jake. These were esteemed very highly by the other slaves and looked upon as the privileged ones on the plantation, for it was no small affair in the eyes of the slave to be allowed to see Baltimore. Colonel Lloyd kept from 300 to 400 slaves on his home plantation, and owned a large number more on the neighboring farms belonging to him. The names of the farms nearest to home plantations were Wide Town and New Design. Wide Town was under the overseerships of a man named Noah Willis. New Design was under the overseership of Mr. Townsend. The overseers of these and all the rest of the farms, numbering over 20, received advice and directions from the managers and the home plantations. This was a great business place. It was the seat of the government. For the whole 20 farms, all disputes among the overseers were settled here. If a slave was convicted of any high misdemeanor, became unmanageable, or evinced and determination to run away. He was brought immediately here, severely whipped, put on board the sloop carried to Baltimore, and sold to Austin Woolfolk or some other slave trader as a warning to the slave remaining. Here, too, the slaves of all the other farms received their monthly allowance of food and their yearly clothing. The men and women slaves received their monthly allowance of food, 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent in fish, and one bushel of cornmeal. Their yearly clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts, 1 pair of linen trousers like the shirts, 1 jacket, 1 pair of trousers for winter made of coarse Negro cloth, 1 pair of stockings, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could not have cost more than $7. The allowance of the slave children was given to their mothers or their old women having the care of them. The children, unable to work in the fields, had neither shoes, stockings, jacket, nor trousers given to them. Their clothing consisted of 2 coarse linen shirts per year. When these failed them, they went naked until the next allowance day. Children from 7 to 10 years old of both sexes almost naked might be seen at all seasons of the year. Man, there were no beds given to the slaves unless 1 coarse blanket be considered such, and none but the men and women had these. This, however, is not considered a very great privation. They find less difficulty from want of beds than from want of time to sleep. For when their day works in the field is done, the most of them having their washings, mending, and cooking to do, and having few or none of the ordinary faculties for doing either of these very many of their sleeping hours are consumed in preparing for the field the coming day, and yet when this is done, old and young, male and female, married and single, drop down side by side on 1 common bed, the cold damp floor, each covering himself or herself in their miserable blankets. And here they slept till they are summoned to the field by the driver's horn. At the sound of this, almost rise and be off to the field. There must be no halting. Every one must have at his or her post. And woe betides them who hear not this morning's summons to the field. For if they are not awakened by the sense of hearing, they are by the sense of feeling. No age, nor sex finds any favor. Mr. Sevier, the overseer, used to stand by the door of the quarter armed with large hickory stick and a heavy cowskin, ready to whip any one who was so unfortunate as not to hear, or from any other cause was prevented from being ready to start for the field at the sound of the horn. Mr. Sevier was rightly named. He was a cruel man. I have seen him whip a woman, causing the blood to run half an hour at the time. At this, too, in the midst of her crying children pleading for their mother's release, he seemed to take pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity. Added to this cruelty, he was a profane swearer. It was enough to chill the blood and stiffen the hair of any ordinary man to hear him talk. Scarce a sentence escaped him but that was commenced or concluded by some horrid oath. The field was the place to witness his cruelty and profanity. His presence made both the field of blood and blasphemy, from the rising till the going down of the sun. He was cursing, raving, cutting, and slashing among the slaves of the field. in the most frightful manner. His career was short. He died very soon after I went to the calling of Lords. He died as he lived, uttering with his dying groans bitter curses and horrid oaths. His death was regarded by the slaves as the result of a merciful providence. Mr. Severe's place was filled by a Mr. Hopkins. He was a very different man. He was less cruel, less profane, he made less noise than Mr. Severe. His curse was characterized by no extraordinary demonstrations of cruelty. He whipped but seemed to take no pleasure in it. He was called by the slaves a good overseer. The home plantation of the Colonel Lloyd wore the appearance of the country village. All the mechanical operations for all the farms were performed here. The shoemaking and the mending, the blacksmithing, the cartwrighting, the coppery, weaving, and grain grinding were all performed by the slaves on the home plantation. The whole place wore a business-like aspect, very unlike the neighboring farms. The number of houses, too, conspired to give it the advantage over the neighboring farms. It was called by the slaves the Gray House Farm. Few privileges were esteemed higher by the slaves of the out farms than that of being selected to do errands. At that Gray House Farm, it was associated in their minds with greatness. A representative could not be prouder of his election to a seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of our out farms would be his elections in the great errands of the Great House Farm. They regarded it was evidence of great confidence. Reposed. Let's reread that. All right. It was associated in their minds with greatness. A representative could not be prouder of his election to seat in the American Congress than a slave on one of the out farms would be of his election to do errands at the Gray House Farm. They regarded it as evidence of great confidence reposed in them, their overseers, and it was on this account, as well as the constant desires to be out on the field from under the driver's lash, that they esteemed it was high privilege, one of the worth careful living for. He was called the smartest and most trusty fellow, who had his honor conferred upon him the most frequently. The competitors for this office sought as diligently to please their overseers, as the office seekers in the political party seek to please. Let's reread that over. The competitors for this office sought as diligently. The competitors for this office sought as diligently to please their overseers, as the office seekers in the political party seek to please and deceive the people. The same traits of character might be seen in the Colonel Lloyd slaves are seen in the slaves of the political parties. Colonial slaves are seen in the slaves of the political party. The slaves selected to go to the Gray House Farm for the monthly allowance for themselves and their fellow slaves were particularly enthusiastic. While on their way, they would make the dense old wood for miles around reverberate with their wild songs, revealing at once the highest joy at their deepest sadness. They would compose and sing as they went along, consulting neither time nor tune. The thought that came out, with not in the word, in the sound, and as frequently in the one in the other. They would sometimes sing the most pathetic sentiments in the most rapturous tone, and the most rapturous sentiments the most pathetic tone. into all of their songs they would manage to weave something of the great house farm. Especially would they do this when leaving home. They would then sing the most exultingly the following words: I am going away to the great house farm. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh. This they would sing as a chorus to words which to many would seem unmeaning jargon, but which nevertheless. This establishment was under the care of two slaves, old Barney and young Barney. Father and son. To attend this establishment was their sole work, but it was by no means as easy employment, for in nothing was Colonial Lloyd more particular than the management of his horses. The slightest inattention to these of unpardonable, and was visited upon those under whose care they were placed, with the severest punishment to excuse could shield them. If the colonel only suspected any want of attention to his horses, the supposition which he frequently indulged, and one which, of course, made the office of the old and young Barney a very trying one. They never knew when they were safe from punishment. They were frequently whipped when least deserving, and escaped whipping when most deserving it. Everything depended upon looks of the horses and the state of Colonial Lloyd's own mind when his horses were brought to him for use. If a horse did not move fast enough or hold his head high enough, it was owing to some fault of his keeper's. It was painful to stand near the stable door and hear the various complaints against the keepers when a horse was taken out for use. This horse has not had proper attention. He has not been sufficiently rubbed or cared, or he has not been properly fed. His food was too wet or too dry. He got it too soon or too late. He was too hot or too cold. He had too much hay or not enough grain, or had too much grain or not enough hay. Instead of old Barney's attending to the horses, he had a very improperly left to his son. To all these complaints, no matter how unjust, the slave must answer never a word. Colonial Lloyd could not brook any contradictions from a slave's. When he spoke, a slave must stand, listen, and tremble. And such it was literally the case. I have been Colonial Lloyd make old Barney, a man between 50 and 60 years of age, uncover his bald head, kneel down upon the cold, damp ground, and receive upon his naked and towel-worn shoulders more than 30 lashes at a time. Colonial Lloyd had 3 sons, Edward, Maury, and Daniel, and 3 sons-in-laws, Mr. Winder, Mr. Nicholson, and Mr. Lawless. All of these lived at the great house farm and enjoyed the luxury of whipping the servants when they pleased, from old Barney down to William Wykes, the couch driver. I have seen Winder make one of the house servants and stand from him in suitable distance to be touched with the end of his whip, and at every stroke raise great ridges upon his back. To describe the wealth of the Colonial Lloyd, he would almost equal to describe the riches of Jobs. He kept from 10 to 15 house servants. He was said to own thousands of slaves. I think this estimate quite within the truth. Colonial Lloyd owned many. He did not know them when he saw them, nor did all the slaves of all forms know him. It is reported of him that while riding along the road one day, he met the colored man and addressed him the usual manner of speaking to colored people on the public highway of the South. Well, boy, whom do you belong to? To Colonel Lloyd replied the slave, well, does the colonel treat you well? No, sir. What was the ready reply. What does he work? What does he work? What does he work you too hard? What does he work you too hard? Yes, sir. Well, don't he give you enough to eat? Yes, sir. He gives me enough, sir. such as it is. The colonel, after ascertaining where the slaves belongs, rode on. The man also went on about his business, not dreaming that he had been conversing with his master. He thought said heard nothing more of the matter until 2 or 3 weeks afterwards. The poor man was then informed by his overseer that for having found fault with his master, he was now to be sold to a Georgia trader. He was immediately chained and handcuffed, and thus, without moment's warning, he was snatched away and forever sundered from his family and friends by a hand more unrelenting than death. This is a penalty of telling the truth, of telling the simple truth in his answer to a series of plain questions. It's partly in consequence of such facts that slaves, when inquired of their condition and the character of their masters, almost universally they saw uncontented, and that their masters are kind. The slaveholders have been known to send spies among their slaves to assert their views and feelings in regard to their conditions. The frequency of this has had effect to establish among the slave the maxim that a still tongue makes a wise head. They suppress the truth rather than take the consequences of telling it, and in so doing improve themselves as part of the human family. If they have anything to say of their masters, it is generally in their master's favor. Especially when speaking to a untried man. I have been frequently asked when a slave if I had a kind master, and do not remember ever to have given a negative answer. Hold on one moment. I think I did. Okay. Oh, my bad. Alright, let's start from the beginning. Especially when speaking to an untried man, I have been frequently asked when a slave if I have a kind master, and do not remember to have given a negative answer. Nor did I, in pursuing this, consider myself as uttering what was absolutely false, for I also measured the kindness of my master by the standard of kindness set up among slaveholders around us. Moreover, slaves are like other people, and by prejudice quite common to others. They think their own better than that of others. Many, under the influence of this prejudice, think their own masters are better than the masters of other slaves, and this too, in some cases, when they very reverse is true. Indeed, it is not uncommon for slaves even to fall out or quarrel among themselves about the relative goodness of their masters, each contending for the superior goodness of his own over that of the others. At the very same time, they mutually execrate their masters when viewed separately. It was so on our plantation when Colonel Lloyd's slaves met the slaves of Jacob Jepson. They seldom parted without a quarrel about their masters, Colonel Lloyd's slaves contending that he was the richest, and Mr. Jepson's slaves that he was the smartest and most of a man. Colonel Lloyd's slaves would boast of his abilities to buy and sell Jacob Jepson. Mr. Jepson's slaves would boast about his abilities to whip Colonel Lloyd. These quarrels were almost always end in a fight between the parties, and those that whipped were supposed to have gained the point at issue. They seemed to think that the greatness of their masters was transferable to themselves. It was considered as being bad enough to be a slave, but to be a poor man's slave was deemed as a disgrace indeed. Interesting. Mr. Hopkins remained but a short time in the office overseer. While his career was so short, I did not know, but suppose he lacked the necessary severities to suit Colonel Lloyd. Mr. Hopkins was succeeded by Mr. Opson Gore, a man possessing in an immense degree all those traits of character indispensable to what is called a first-rate overseer. Mr. Gore had served Colonel Lloyd in the capacity of overseer upon one of the out farms, and had shown himself worthy of the high station of overseers upon the home of a great house farm. Mr. Gore was proud, ambitious, and persevering. He was artful, cruel, and obdurate. He was just the man for such a place, and it was just the place for such a man. It afforded a scope for the full exercise for all his powers, and seemed to be perfectly at home in it. He was one of those who could torture the slightest look, word, and gesture on the part of the slave into impudence, and would treat it accordingly. There must be no answering back to him. No explanation was allowed a slave showing himself to have been wrongfully accused. Mr. Gore acted fully up in the maxim laid down by slaveholders. It's better than a dozen slaves suffer under the lash than that overseer should be convicted in the presence of the slave of having been at fault. No matter how innocent a slave might be, it availed him nothing when accused by Mr. Gore of any misdemeanor. To be accused was to be convicted, and to be convicted was to be punished by one always following the other immutable certainty. To escape punishment was to escape accusation, and few slaves had the fortune to do either. Under the overseership of Mr. Gore, he was just proud enough to demand the most debasing homage of the slaves, and quite severe enough to crouch himself at the feet of the master. He was ambitious enough to be contented with nothing short of the highest rank of overseers, and persevering enough to reach the height of ambition. He was cruel enough to inflict the severest punishment, artful enough to descend to the lowest trickery, and obdurate enough to be insensible to voice of the reproving conscience. And provoking conscience. He was of all overseers the most dreaded by the slaves. His presence was painful. His eye flashed confusion, and seldom was his sharp, shrill voice heard without producing horror or trembling in their ranks. Mr. Gore was a grave man, and though a young man, he indulged with no jokes, said no funny words, seldom smiled. His words were in perfect keeping with his looks, and his looks were in perfect keeping with his words. Overseers will sometimes indulge in witty word with the slaves, not so with Mr. Gore. He spoke but to command and commanded but to be obeyed. He dealt sparingly with his words and bountifully with his whip, never using the former where the latter would answer as well. When he whipped, he seemed to do so from the sense of duty and feared no consequences. He did nothing radically, no matter how disgraceful, always at his post, never inconsistent. He never promised but to fulfill. He was in word a man of the most inflexible firmness and stone-like coolness. His savage barbarity was equaled only by consummate coolness with which he committed the grossest and most savage deeds upon the slaves under his charge. Mr. Gore once undertook to whip one of the Colonel Lloyd's slaves by the name of Denby. He had given Denby a few stripes when, to get rid of some scourging, he ran and plunged himself into a creek and stood there at the depth of his shoulders, refusing to come out. Mr. Gore told him he would give him 3 calls, and that if he did not come out on the 3rd call, he would shoot him. The 1st call was given. Denby had no response but stood his ground. The 2nd and 3rd calls were given with the same result. Mr. Gore then, without consultation or deliberation with anyone, not even giving Denby an additional call, raised his musket to his face, taking a deadly aim at his standing victim, and in an instant poor Denby was no more. His mangled body sank out of sight, and the blood and brains marked the water where he stood. A thrill of horror flashed through every soul upon that plantation excepting Mr. Gorge. He alone seemed cool and collective. He was asked by Colonel Lloyd and my old master why he resorted to this extraordinary expedient. His reply was, as well as I can remember, that Denby had become unmanageable. He was setting a dangerous example to the other slaves, one which, if suffered to pass without some such a demonstration on his part, would finally lead to the total subversion of all rule and order upon the plantation. He argued that if one slave refused to be corrected and escape with his life, the other slaves would soon copy an example, the results of which would be the freedom of slaves and the enslavement of the whites. Mr. Gore's defense was satisfactory. He was continued in his station as overseer upon the home plantation. His fame as an overseer went aboard. His horrid crime has not even submitted to a judicial investigation. It was committed to the presence of slaves, and they of course could neither institute a suit nor testify against him, and thus the guilty perpetrator of one of the bloodiest and most foul murders goes unwhipped of justice, and ensured by the community in which he lives. Mr. Gore lived in St. Michael's, Talbot County, Maryland. When I left there, if he is still alive, he very probably lives there now, and if so, he is now as he was then, as highly esteemed and as much respected as though his guilty soul had not been stained with his brother's blood. I speak it violently when I say this, that killing a slave or any colored person in Talbot County, Maryland, is not treated as a crime, either by the courts or community. Mr. Thompson, landman of St. Michael's, killed 2 slaves on one whom he killed with a hatchet by knocking his brains out. He used to boast of the commission of the awful and bloody deed. I have heard him do so laughingly, saying among other things that he was only benefactor of his county and the company, and that when others would do as much as he had done, we should be relieved of the dead, probably the dead niggers. The wife of Mr. Giles Hick, living but a short distance from where I used to live, murdered my wife's cousins, a young girl between 15 and 16 years of age, mangling her person in the most horrible manner, breaking her nose and breastbone with a stick so that the poor girl expired in a few hours afterwards. She was immediately buried, but had not been in her untimely grave but a few hours before she was taken up and examined by a coroner, who decided that she had come to her death by severe beating. The offense for which this girl was thus murdered was this: she had been set that night she had been set that night to mind Mr. Hick's baby, and during the night she fell asleep and the baby cried. She, having lost her rest for the several nights previous, did not hear the crying. They were both in the room with Mr. Hicks. Mr. Hicks, finding the girl slow to move, jumped from her bed, seized an oak stick by a wood fireplace with the broke the girl's nose and breastbone, and thus ended her life. I will not say that this most horrid murder produced no sensation in community. It did produce sensation, but not enough to bring the murderess to punishment. There was a warrant issued for her arrest, but it was never served. Thus she escaped not only punishment, but even the pain of being arraigned before a court for her horrid crime. Which I am detailing bloody deeds which took place during my stay at Colonel Lloyd's plantation. I will briefly narrate other which occurred about the same time as murder of Denby by Mr. Gore. Colonel Lloyd's slaves were in the habit of spending a part of their nights and Sunday fishing for oysters. In this way made up the deficiency of their scanty allowance. An old man belonging to the Colonel Lloyd, while thus engaged, happened to get beyond the limits of Colonel Lloyd's and on the premise of Mr. Bill Bondley. At this trespass, Mr. Bondley took offense, and with his musket came down to the shore and blew its deadly contents into the poor old man. Mr. Bondley came over to see Colonel Lloyd's the next day, whether to pay him for his property or to justify himself in what he had done, I know not. At any rate, this whole fiendish transaction was soon hushed up. There was very little said about it all, and nothing done. It was a common saying, even among the little white boys, that it was worth half a cent to kill a nigger, and half a cent to bury one. And we go on to chapter 5, and that's where we leave off. I think we read a lot, but yeah, man, it's getting pretty good, man. I must say. Let me put this shit in here. Yeah, so we made it to chapter 5, and we'll read chapter 5 next, one of the next episodes. So this is Mitra Blue episode series. This is Bird Rabbit. We just did the book read. Hope you enjoyed that. Thank you.